Now you're at the step where you're writing your research proposal. And in this chapter, we'll talk about some of the considerations that you need to think about in developing your own research proposal. In order to create a successful research proposal, some of the things that you need to include is, first, clearly stated problem. What is the problem that led to this particular research investigation? What are your specific hypotheses and research or research questions? So sometimes, depending on the type of data analysis, a hypothesis is more appropriate, or a research question. So you need to figure out which is appropriate for your study. Then precise definition of terms. I talked about this in your assignment as the operational definition of terms. And in terms of precise definitions, not only do I expect that you can define each variable of interest, so if it's anxiety, how do you define anxiety? There are several ways in the literature that we can define anxiety. But the second part of an operational definition is to also specify how it will be measured. So thinking about not only how the variable is defined, but also how it is measured are the two aspects of what we call operational definition. So you want to be really precise. It's not that one definition is better than the other, it's that this is how you are defining it in your research study. And you could substantiate that with previous literature that has defined it in a similar way. So even if there are multiple ways of operationalizing the variable that you're interested in, how have you operationalized it in your study? You also want to carefully think about and identify any limitations to your study. Perhaps the limitation is that you can't have a representative sample, so therefore that will limit our ability to generalize our results, which we talked about in the last chapter. And you want to be really specific about all of the limitations and delimitations of your study. You also want to explain what is the purpose of your study. So first you created this argument for why this problem is important to investigate. But then you want to explain, and you'll see this in a lot of research articles, the purpose of the current study was to, and then fill in that blank. Specific details about all aspects of the data collection and interpretation must also be specified in a research proposal. How will you collect the data? And how are you planning on interpreting that data? Some characteristics of a good research proposal are: 1, a straightforward document containing only necessary information. In research, we call this the principle of parsimony, keeping it as simple as possible. This is not a free writing exercise. This is an exercise where we want to use the most precise wording possible, not overstate what we're doing, and being very specific about what it is that we're referring to. There needs to be a clear organization in your proposal, and in this course we're following the organization that is of research proposals as determined by the American Psychological Association, or APA. So, what do you need to include in a quantitative research proposal, which will be different than a qualitative one? First, you want to identify what is the problem and its setting. What is the review of the literature? So, review the literature, substantiate that hypothesis. Then you want to discuss what is the data and how are you treating the data, what are you doing to it? And you also want to include typically the qualifications of a researcher and a team, especially if you're submitting this proposal for funding. They want to know that you're qualified and equipped to be able to carry out this study. The study outline, like how long will it take, what are you going to do, how are you going to do it, your references, and any appendices, which typically have measurement tools, instrument, any other instrument tools that you have, assessments, rating scales, survey instruments, informed consent, anything else that, any other materials that you're using in your study, you want to give a copy of them in the appendix section. The organization of your qualitative proposal will have an introduction where you're talking about what it is that you're doing, which actually does also include a literature review. Your methodology, so what type of qualitative study are you proposing? Some findings, a management plan, so how you plan to manage the project and a timeline. Is it feasible? A lot of times qualitative studies can take quite a bit of time. Your references, and again, your appendices. In writing your proposal, obviously you'd want to use a word processing software such as Word, and you want to keep it very organized using the guidelines that, in this case, we're talking about guidelines from the American Psychological Association. You want to make sure that there's a logical sequence within your proposal. One of the best ways to do this is to make sure that, especially when we get to the written component, which is coming for assignment 2, is you want to start thinking about, one, this introduction paragraph being really broad in establishing what is the overall idea that we're investigating, why is it important. You have a thesis statement, a great introductory sentence. You end that first paragraph with a really solid thesis statement, and you kind of highlight what it is that you're doing without directly talking about it. And then you have lots of good topic sentences to start your paragraphs, and very good, strong segue sentences into the next paragraph to develop what I call a cohesiveness of narrative throughout your proposal. And then by the end of your introduction, for example, you have your hypotheses research questions. So you really want to build up to that in a really cohesive, organized way. So again, you want to present your research problem at the beginning, provide a context for the problem. So again, you're presenting your research problem, not your research question. I want to be really specific about that. You're identifying that there's a problem that should be investigated and why it's important. You're providing a context for the problem. What are the factors that impact it? And then you're convincing the reader in this process of why it's an important project. Always assume that your reader knows nothing about your project. Never assume common knowledge. In research papers, we want to be really specific about everything that we're talking about, referring to. When writing your research proposal, you want to communicate that you have an open mind about what you will find. So trying to limit any of those biases. We want to describe your methodology. We talked a lot about this in the last chapter on what type of methodology we would use and be really precise about how you're going to carry that out. Describe where any pre-existing data are located and how you plan to obtain them, and describe how you will use the data to answer your research problem. And for the appendices, you want to use them wisely. So you don't want to inundate your reader with tons of appendices, but use appendices that are really important and relevant for your study. In the process of writing a proposal, you really need to take some time and revise it. And one of the most important things you could do is write a proposal and step back from it. Sometimes we're so immersed in it that we can't see the full picture. So one thing that we can do is ourselves revise it, right? We can also ask for a fresh set of eyes, ask a peer to revise it for us. And make sure that we scrutinize everything that you have written and that you have substantiated everything with reference, a citation, and that you're not making any claims on your own. Be really consistent about the terminology that you use, and make sure that you use that same terminology to refer to the same concepts throughout the body of your paper. In revising your proposal, you also want to look for anything that's ambiguous, anything that might not be clear. Again, the principle of parsimony comes to mind. Keep your sentences simple and straightforward. Choose your wording carefully. Make sure that the wording that you use is appropriate for your discipline. So if you're describing something, but there's a specific term that's used for that in your discipline, use that term. But don't try to just go to a thesaurus and find lofty words to describe things that don't make it really precise and succinct. Make sure that you're only using the wording that is appropriate for your study. Make sure, again, that it's clear and concise and straightforward. And then, as always, check for grammar, punctuation, and spelling errors. In your list of citations, check that there's a one-to-one correspondence. Make sure you never cite anything in your reference section that put anything in your reference section that you haven't cited in your paper. So for every reference in your reference list, there should be at least one or more citations in text in your proposal or research paper. Also consider the feasibility of your project. Again, is this feasible? Can I carry it out? Are there any logistical constraints, ethical constraints, etc.? Again, and in this, especially your online learners, make sure you look at a printed copy. It does make a difference to print it on paper, review it on paper. It's good to do edits electronically as much as possible, but when you're close to the end, I always recommend printing it on paper and going through it with a pencil in hand, just checking it, highlighting it, making changes, and making sure it all makes sense. And again, always get feedback from others when possible. Look for and correct any weaknesses. Are there any weaknesses in your argument? Is your research unclear? Did you establish the purpose? Did you establish its importance? Make sure that your hypothesis is well defined. So you want to make sure that it's something that is testable. Is the problem too complex, or have you really narrowed it down to the key elements of the problem that you want to investigate? And make sure that it has relevance to your field. Other things that you want to think about and correct for weaknesses is the description of the design and method. Make sure that, again, it's super clear, it's super concise, and that it's accurate. So if you establish that you're conducting an observational design, everything in your description should link back to that type of design methodology. So make sure that once you select a design, that your procedures, steps, analyses, etc., all tie back to that design that you just defined. Make sure that the data that you collect, again, is appropriate for the type of research problem. And then check if methodology is accurate and appropriate. So for this type of question, is a qualitative study appropriate, or would a quantitative study be more appropriate? Those are all questions you want to ask yourself. You also want to check for any weaknesses related to research design and methodology that are regarding lack of controls. So make sure that we're limiting, even when it's not experimental. We want to try to increase our internal validity as much as we possibly can. Make sure that we have the appropriate controls. We're controlling for everything except for what is of interest in our study. Make sure your equipment is up to date and appropriate, and make sure that you really think about the type of statistical analysis and if it's appropriate for the type of study and the type of data that you're collecting. You also want to check for any weaknesses regarding you as the investigator. Do you have enough training or experience for the type of design that you proposed? Are you familiar enough with the literature for the proposed research project? And do you have sufficient time to devote to the project? Which goes back again to the feasibility of it. Also, you want to think about weaknesses related to resources. Is the institution, the gatekeepers of the institution, you can propose a wonderful study in the schools, but will you have access to the schools? Again, going back to feasibility of the project, right? Will the gatekeepers allow you access? Once you have access, if you're dealing with children, will you get parental consent? So these are all questions that you need to consider. So you can propose a wonderful study, but if you don't actually have access to the institution, how would you ever implement it, carry it out? And then what type of equipment, support staff, or other resources would you need? So for example, if it requires you to conduct intelligence tests and you need to hire a psychologist, as I had in a previous example, do you have the funding to do that? Do you have accessibility to psychologists? Do you have psychologists who are willing to do it? So those are all questions you need to ask yourself as well. Other things to look and correct for, anything that can take away from your proposal's effectiveness. Again, make sure that the statement of the problem is clear. Make sure that you completely describe your methodology. Make sure that you not only describe the problem generally, but all of the sub-problems that are relevant to your study. And make sure that the way in which you word your proposal is suitable for the type of analysis and for the way in which it will be evaluated by others. You also want to look for and correct any deviation of the formatting from the guidelines of the institution. So again, in this case, we're talking about APA guidelines on this course. Always include sources. So never make any claims that you cannot support with a reference. And make sure that, again, you completely cite all sources. I would say oversight when possible, but don't overquote. So try to paraphrase as much as possible in your own words. A lot of times, one statement will have several citations, and you'll see this in a number of research articles. And never go through and just say Article 1 said this, Article 2 said this, Article 3 said this. Instead, what you want to do in a proposal is really have this seamless cohesiveness, so you're not really emphasizing the other research studies as much as you're building an argument for your research study by piecing together what has been done by others. Now, if you're creating a proposal for a funding agency, you also want to think about does it address the research area outlined by that funding agency of interest? Make sure that the proposal isn't too ambitious for the amount of money that you're being given. So let's say if I'm proposing a project for a funding agency that's willing to grant $500, making sure that the equipment isn't thousands of dollars, that hiring skilled research assistants wouldn't be hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars. So make sure that it's not too ambitious for the amount of money that they're even offering, because they'll look at that and say, well, you can't really accomplish this, so it doesn't matter if we give you $500, you're not going to be able to carry it out with this amount of money. And then make sure that all items included in the budget are allowed by the terms of the grant that you're asking funding for if you're going forth looking for funding. And also, when you're looking for funding from a funding agency, you want to make sure that you are really clear about the costs associated with your study and that they are accurate. You also want to make sure that you are fitting within the guidelines of what the grant was developed to do. So if the grant is developed to support education in low SES neighborhoods, that you're not proposing to conduct something in a high SES neighborhood. If the grant is designed to facilitate education in a rural neighborhood, that you're not proposing to go to an urban area. So these seem pretty straightforward, but you may have a really great project, but maybe it doesn't fit within the guidelines of the grant. So always make sure that there is a good match between the grant and what it is that you're proposing. And that concludes writing a research proposal.